Okay, good morning, Alex.
Good morning.
This is Tom Tresser at Adler University's Nonprofit Management online master's degree program, and Alex Wiesendanger of the Shriver Center for Poverty Law, who is the field director and policy specialist for the Responsible Budget Coalition, has graciously agreed to answer some questions from the students of the nonprofit advocacy class.
Let's do it.
All right, so the first question is, could you just explain what is this place and what is the coalition?
Sure. So the Responsible Budget Coalition began in 2010 in the first sort of iteration of our current budget crisis and is sort of the definition of a big tent coalition. So labor, faith, human service, education, healthcare, community organizing groups all around the state, more than 300 organizations that recognize that we shouldn't be fighting over how we slice up the pie so much as saying the state doesn't have enough revenue. So the RBC is organized around three principles: no more cuts to vital services, raising adequate revenue to repair the damage that's been done and make smart investments in the things we care about, and justice in how that revenue is raised. And that's been sort of the constant campaign through the first round of the temporary tax increase, 2 years of the budget impasse, finally getting a budget, and now focusing on the fair income tax.
So, what brought all this for those of our viewers who are not familiar with what's going on in Illinois? What called all that forth?
Sure. So I think there's two things to understand. The first is a long-term problem, what we call a structural deficit in the Illinois budget. Basically saying our revenue system is not designed to keep pace with the growth of our economy. And what that means at its essence is if you had a balanced budget in 1 year and kept everything the same, our needs of costs with just cost of living increases don't increase or increase faster than our revenue. And that means you get a little deficit. And over years and years, that deficit grows, and our state had done a lot of kind of tricks. The biggest one being not paying into our pension system, instead of raising enough money to pay for the things that pretty much everyone has agreed we need and want. And then the fiscal crisis happened. Yeah. And all of a sudden, none of those tricks were enough. And there was a recognition just across sector that the state was in huge trouble, and that called for the need to raise revenue and finally do that. So that's what brought folks together in sort of 2009, 2010 to pass that first temporary tax increase.
And Illinois is not a poor state.
No, Illinois is the fifth largest economy of any state in the country. It's a fairly well-off state. We are actually, though, not a high-tax state.
That's interesting, because
you often hear the
opposite.
But if you take, in totality, all of the money you spend on state and local taxes combined, we rank sort of in the lower half, so between sort of 27th and 30th, and again, kind of in the middle bottom third of Midwest states. Now, there is, to be fair, one tax in which Illinois is relatively high in, and that's property tax. Oh, yeah. And the reason for that is very simply because the state doesn't do its job. Illinois is 50th. I haven't looked at the numbers this year. Maybe we're 48th. But we're toward the very bottom in terms of state support for public education.
And for our viewers who are not from Illinois and who are from other states where things might be a little different, I think it's important for our constituents who are in the social service world, who are trying to repair, remediate, cure, and serve, why that's something to note wherever they are. Are they a progressive, regressive, fair state? Do they rely on property taxes, or there's some other thing that's going on that would help them do their job? So is it fair to say that in a state like Illinois, which is not producing enough revenue and therefore has a lot of reliance on a property tax, that is regressive and problematic?
Yes, it's incredibly regressive and problematic. And the other thing it does is it penalizes lower income communities.
Yes.
So when you don't use progressive forms of revenue, you're forced. So low income areas, and Chicago is certainly one of these, but the areas that are hurt the most are actually not Chicago. They're downstate communities that have low income and not a lot of property wealth, places like East St. Louis, which are forced because the state does not do its basic job of providing support for education particularly. they're forced. They do what any one of us would do. They work harder to provide money for their schools, but it means they have to raise incredibly high property tax values, and they sort of are squeezing out of a turnip, basically.
And so, again, a policy point for our listeners and viewers. Therefore, your zip code, the luck of your birth, shall we say, is determinant.
Incredibly determinant. And what it also means is obviously it gives sort of anti-tax folks a talking point, right? So they're always slamming, we should lower property taxes, we should lower property taxes. But to talk about that without talking about raising revenue on the state level to replace it is fundamentally irresponsible.
All right, so I hope we have a good understanding. The students have also access to your website and other your materials.
Absolutely.
So from our Adlerians, some of the questions that I would like to ask you is, I'm curious is where one would start on a very local level, maybe counties, which is where this particular student is operating, to help with budget cuts and our money for homeless people. Who would be a best approach there, do you think?
It's a great question, and a lot of it does depend on your local context. But even at a county level, I would point out that you also have a local state rep who cares a lot about what's happening within your area. So you need to look at where funding from your services comes from currently and where it could come from. A local city alderman can be a really helpful champion depending on sort of your analysis of how your particular city or county moves. Right, Chicago has a incredibly weak city council in many ways, and so there's some challenges about how you approach that. But I would say you look at the people who actually represent your agency, the geographic area that you cover. You bring them out and you show them the work that you're doing. I think the other thing that human services have done a terrible job at generally is we have not talked about ourselves as economic engines. But the fact is we are. If you look in Illinois, almost every county, the leading employers are education services, healthcare services, and social services, right? You employ people, you provide jobs. And those jobs tend to be decent, right? You're not making six figures, but they're also not, flipping burgers at McDonald's, for instance. And so making that case of we are providing economic sufficiency, we are assisting in providing a thriving community as well as doing the sort of core work. Most of us get into this work because we talk about how we're caring for people, which is good, but it's only part of the story. And I think that's the other thing we need to tell, right? When you do a budget cut, when you cut social services, you're destroying jobs. And that's a way to kind of cut across the aisle.
And so you could say, look at your brothers and sisters over at the Chamber of Commerce. They're doing sort of advocacy, speaking out. They're making sure their members are taken care of and are not dissed and so forth. And so you have to have that sort of mindset, perhaps.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Does Illinois have any nonprofits that provide teaching to people how to garden in their backyards to supplement their food bill?
I saw this question. I don't know the specific answer. I do know that there's a lot of really good nonprofits that are looking at sort of local agriculture and urban agriculture. I would look at Growing Home here in Chicago, does a lot of that. And the Illinois Stewardship Alliance pays a lot of attention to supporting kind of small farmers across the state and thinking about how we do things like local produce.
Yeah, I think I know this student is also interested in sort of this is a giveaway of localism, in which sort of growing it close to home is one of those things. So I guess do you have anything to say about sort of the localism movement and how that might connect with what you're up to here?
Yeah, I don't know that it connects a lot with the sort of the state budget work, but I think it speaks to kind of a general need that we all have as you think about climate change, you think about how to provide local economies, you think about the alternatives to big box stores that take money out of our economy. Anything we can do to create local economic growth, I think, is useful. I used to have to explain this. I lived in Pilsen here in Chicago for a while, and I promise this story will make sense in a minute. And one of the longtime neighborhood restaurants was a place called Nuevo Leon. Been in the neighborhood for 100 years, and when you take people there, they would ask, why don't they accept credit cards? They only took cash. And one of the reasons some economist actually did a study that every dollar that was spent in Nuevo Leon circulated 7 times in the neighborhood before it left. Right, because it was locally owned and local people worked there and it paid cash and they went and spent that cash at another local place. So it creates a lot of healthy economic activity, which is really, really important for our neighborhoods, right? Even low-income neighborhoods have money. That's why people want to come there. That's why businesses want to go there and sell. But if we think about how we make that money go further, it's about how many times does it circulate. Do you spend it once at a store that's owned somewhere else and the money immediately leaves, or do you spend it locally to someone who spends it locally? That's how you drive economic activity and build more thriving local economies.
I think that's very instructive. So here's a question that's sort of, I guess this is more of a tactical question about the media, how you use media, how do you work with other nonprofits? Because part of what I'm hearing here is a little bit of telling your story in a powerful way, perhaps in a way that we're not used to doing.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about how you work with the media or what your thoughts are about
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's some general things about, do you actually have a story, right? Do you have something new that you can share? Have you built a relationship with the people who cover this? And I think especially when you do statewide advocacy work like we do, local papers are looking for stories. And so if local folks on the ground cultivate a relationship with, the local reporter, they're looking for stories. But I think what you have to do is also connect it to a larger issue, right? So for us, it's how do we connect the fact that your local homeless shelter is now only open 3 nights a week, and tell that story, but also connect it to that is because of decisions at a statewide level, and then point towards sort of a reason, a person that's causing that to happen, and a solution. The other thing that I think is important, because I remember when you sent me that question, how do we decide who we're using as spokespeople, right? Who's being brought forward?
Who's telling whose story?
Yeah, and I think that's really important. I also think from an organizing perspective, I think about a couple things when I think about which service providers particularly should I call when someone says, hey, I'm doing a story, because the other way this happens is a reporter calls you, right? And they say, you're the statewide coalition. I'm looking at budget cuts. Can you give me someone to talk about it? So is it local? But the other thing we look at is, are those people going to communicate a campaign story, and have they been doing that work, right? If we're going to raise up good work, we want to raise up the people who are also in the fight. And I think many social service providers often don't engage on policy, and I think that's a mistake for a couple reasons, and we can get in further into why it's every social service agency's job to do budget advocacy. But I think the other piece is, if you're only willing to tell about your good work and how budget cuts hurt you, but you're not willing to do the work of what do we need to do to fix that, I'd be less likely to put a reporter in contact with you. And I think also, as you're thinking about building a relationship with your local elected officials, what I hear all the time is, you all will come and tell us how bad budget cuts are, and you'll line up and fill hearing rooms, but none of you are here when I have to actually advocate for the revenue. And if you're not here when I advocate for the revenue, no one has my back. And then, frankly, if I have to carry all the water to raise taxes and raise revenue, why should I give it to you?
So that displays a kind of an ignorance of the whole process.
Yep.
You hurt when you hurt.
Yeah.
But you don't have the full picture to know where it's strategic for you to show up.
Yeah.
And
or you're not willing to. A lot of social service agencies have been unwilling to say raise revenue, and that's really problematic when we're advocating for our services, right? There's no such thing as a free lunch, and we have to be willing to do that work.
Well, you say you think it's the job of every social service, sort of nonprofit-y, let's call them community-facing organizations, to be in this game. But so so I'm the executive director of a shelter in Rockford or something, and how did I get to be the executive director? Do I have a master's? Did I come up through the ranks? So where do I get my smarts, Alex?
Yeah.
So that I'm there when you call.
Right.
You don't have to educate me.
Yeah, and I think the good news is that there are organizations like ours in pretty much every state that will do some of here's how we get into it. I don't think social service agencies or community-facing agencies need to become intricate policy experts, but they need to be able to say, and I heard this from an executive recently, whatever your first job is, whatever service your core service is, your second job is budget advocacy.
Budget advocacy.
Because most of our agencies rely on state money.
I'm going to make that a giant billboard.
It's a vital giant billboard. Your second job is budget advocacy.
I'm going to make a T-shirt out of that.
And frankly, even if you're an agency that doesn't take public money, and there are very few agencies that's true of, your clients need those other services.
See, now that's why we teach this class, and we hope that lesson sticks. And
if you take nothing else away from this conversation,
that's right.
Take that.
And so, if we had more time in another format, we would digress and talk about how would we do that. So, in the training that we give our executive directors, whether they're in formal places like institution universities or in United Way places where people might learn their chops, we need to put this into their menu of must-have skills.
Yeah, we have to learn how to advocate. We have to learn how to talk about revenue.
So this next question is also sort of related to this, is how did you learn to analyze a policy and propose alternatives? I mean, it's sort of a bit of the same question, is how should nonprofit leaders go about developing these skills?
Yeah.
And then she says a follow-up, should nonprofits be able to read budget bills? Well, I guess the
answer simple answer to that is yes.
Yes,
you may not need to understand the full 500-page budget book, but you have to look at some of the basic things. One, you have to know what line items your funding comes out of, and you have to see what's happening in those line items, right? Are they going up? Are they going down? Are they at least staying even with inflation, right? Because if the number is flat from last year, it means there's a cut somewhere.
You're taking a hit.
Yeah, and so you need to know that, and you need to look at the revenue side. How are we raising revenues? Because that's the core thing. If you don't have proper input on the front end, you won't get good output on the back end. And if we don't invest in your services, we can't do the work that's important. So how do you build these skills, which is a really good question. The first thing I think you do is you don't do it alone. You hook up with state budget advocacy organizations. For people around, I'll give a shout out to a really good national group, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, which has a state priorities partnership in organization in almost every state that kind of leads this work, analyzing the state budgets and kind of focusing in on how do we choose revenue, choose progressive revenue, instead of cuts that are destructive. And so hook up with those organizations or others. I also know very few communities around the country where there isn't some community organization running around hoping to recruit institutional members like service providers. And they really want that, and they will provide some of those levels of training.
So it might suggest, even though you might say be in the shelter world or teenage literacy or something like that, you might know that somewhere around your area there could be like a Industrial Areas Foundation or more traditional community organizing type group that you would,
Gamaliel, there's someone
that you might not think that you have a relationship with,
but you should. You can. So I would absolutely say those are some of the places to go.
Because the next question is sort of related to that, is in terms of how do you find allies and advocates. So you're a coalition builder, so you are on the hunt, obviously, for your likely suspects.
Yeah.
But for others, this idea of coalition building, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things that I think are really exciting. One is more and more I'm seeing service providers do kind of service-based coalitions of saying we all are interacting with families, right? We're all interacting with these folks. How do we get all the different service providers together in a room and say, where do we see holes? Where is there overlap? How can we find kind of synergies among our work to be more efficient? And that's a very natural way to do coalitional work. The next step that most people aren't taking but need to is ask, what are the policy levers that are affecting our clients? Because this is the thing, you already know them. You know what your clients are struggling with, right? We seem to be in the homeless realm, so let's just stay there, right?
Yeah.
If you're working with homeless families, you know what's happening. You know why they're homeless. You know, okay, there aren't job opportunities, or you know they're here because we're the only shelter that lets families stay together. Or you know this person needs mental health treatment and can't access it. Or you know this person can't get a job because they have a felony record, and so they keep ending up with me. So those are all policy problems. And so beginning to think about all of that is really important. And then the second thing, of course, is if you start talking if you get 10 nonprofit executives in a room for a candid conversation, eventually you're all going to say, and we don't have enough money. And that means, okay, how do we advocate for that? And I think one of the secrets that the Responsible Budget Coalition has learned, and I don't know that this is a huge secret, but it is, I think maybe we don't say it enough or people don't get there, is that when you get into don't cut me, cut him, you lose. You will always lose and will always be fighting for less. When you stand together on saying the answer is to raise revenue, because all of us, and this is across the country, since the 80s, there's been a significant and consistent disinvestment, right? The line is like this. Now maybe it's sort of like this, but it's a huge disinvestment.
I know your history.
In our social service sectors and our public institutions generally. And so if we don't stand together and say we need to invest, we need to make smart investments, and we need to be willing to talk about taxation as investment. This is how we create and invest in constructing a thriving community. When we do that together, we have the opportunity. All you have to do is look at what's being cut, and you know who your natural allies are. They're everyone who's affected by that, and there's lots and lots of agencies out there.
And it requires a little courage, I think, and to change this narrative essentially from scarcity to abundance.
Yes.
Because if you accept the narrative of scarcity, then I'm always going to be fighting you. Because I want my money for literacy over your money for parks.
Right.
Because literacy is more important than parks.
Right, and that's absolutely a losing argument, and what we need to be shifting to is looking at why don't we have the resources we need.
Exactly.
And there's any number of levers that'll get you there. Obviously here in Illinois, one of our core things is the fact that we have a flat income tax,
Right.
which means where most wealth is, we're not taxing. And so we're hurting middle class and working families and not getting the money we need. And there's lots of other ways we need to talk about and thinking about taxing wealth, right? Sort of doing the reverse of the current national plan.
Exactly. So this requires, again, getting people together, a little bit of history, a little bit of courage, some facts that you might normally not have, because if you're concerned with literacy, you might not be you might not be getting these other things. Being in a relationship with people perhaps you're not in a relationship with, and being able to then sort of make your argument to the right people at the right time about what you're saying is, don't cut, that's a loser.
Yeah, don't make that don't say don't cut me, cut him, say we need to raise revenue.
So is there practical legislation that's in the works to fix this sort of horrible situation?
Yes, so I think there's a couple things. One is we've just passed legislation to continue to sort of use what's called a Prompt Payment Act. So Illinois went through an incredibly long budget deficit, as most people probably know, and just didn't pay, right? We signed contracts with social service providers and then just didn't pay them. And so there is some good legislation, one, that actually charges the state interest on doing that and has been passed. And that's really good because it incentivizes payment, which is the goal, right? We want to pay people for the work they do. We want to do that. There was also some legislation that just passed to kind of mandate showing where those bills are instead of kind of letting people hold back and not report them. And then, I think the most important is legislation to raise the revenue to actually dig ourselves out of this hole. And so we're beginning the work to amend Illinois' constitution to finally create a fair income tax with higher rates for higher incomes.
That's really big thinking.
Yeah.
Okay, so that would be sort of like you say, the structural deficit. This would be a structural fix.
Yeah, and you have to have a structural fix.
Okay. If you were advising a nonprofit that relies partly on government funding, what would you tell them?
Your number two job is budget advocacy. That is the place. Now, certainly there are places we need to look at. A lot of organizations are saying we need to diversify our funding streams, and that's true. But if I can digress a little, I think that we as a state and in many ways as a nation have made sort of a basic social contract that we have begun to say we agree by and large, even across the spectrum generally, in some understanding of what our social safety net should look like, schools, etc. But we've also made a pact that instead of government providing that directly, it will contract with nonprofit organizations to do that. Now, what that means is we have to pay those nonprofits. And one of the reasons that I think conservatives were happy we made that deal is that when government provided it, that meant the people providing it were a unionized workforce that were going to push very, very hard on things like budgets. And outsourcing to the private sector, a lot of us have been much more shy about doing that, right? And fighting for rate increases. And so we need to understand that to live out that basic contract that we created, we need to invest. So that would be the first thing that we can't let go of.
So that's almost everybody needs to know this.
Everybody needs to know this.
It's not just if you work in a nonprofit, but if you consume service from a nonprofit. So that suggests to me, Alex, an educational role for all nonprofits in serving the public to make them understand what they're doing. It's like you came here to, your leg is broke, you're illiterate, you want services, you have a drug problem, whatever brought you to our doors, we may not be here for you.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is that we want to be careful about how we tell our story. What we don't want to do is the sort of poverty porn argument. We don't want to make individual arguments. We need to make arguments about us, right? Because maybe I'm not illiterate, and so I'm saying, why should, and yes, it's 3 cents of my tax dollars, but why should that go to people who, right? Yes, instead, we need to talk about the things we all care about and how this builds our community. Right, and the things we all need for a thriving community. Everyone needs a solid foundation. And when you think about this, right, how do we construct the kind of communities we want to live in? If you ask anyone, like, what is a thriving community? What do you want to live in? We talk about places with, healthy families and great schools and safe streets, and we want resources, we want parks, and we want, when bad things happen, we want to know people are taken care of, and that's what we as the public sector and the human service sector provide, and those are the stories we need to tell about how we invest in that and what happens when we disinvest.
So that's, again, this idea of this general understanding. The average person says, well, I understand what government does, I understand what business does, I'm not quite sure what these other guys do. And so you're suggesting
we have to educate,
fill that story out, because that will help us with a platform, a solid base for when we go to our legislators or go to the voters or what have you.
Yeah, when we want to make the case, right? Because every elected official is scared of the T word.
Yeah.
And so we need to make the case. And then I think the last thing we need to educate people on is we have a complete disconnect. We do not understand that taxes are inputs and we get something for it.
Yeah.
Right? We fundamentally don't get it. In the Illinois budget debate, I was astonished when you looked at the polling during the budget impasse. 20% said we should fix this with revenue. Great. 40% said we should do cuts and revenue, and 40% said cuts. So 80% of Illinois basically said there should be cuts. And then the same poll asked, should we cut this, the things?
No.
70+% on everything said no. So people do not make the connection of what their tax dollars fund and pay for. And we need to draw that out. If this is the investment we make, and this is what we get.
I think that's a key piece of knowledge that people should take to heart. I think people are getting a sense here of what's going on, but could you just articulate a little bit about how your organization has been really making a difference in this very complicated stew here?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is we've simplified it, and we've been that unifying force that has continued to push this message of it is not about cuts, it's not about inefficiencies, it's about a lack of revenue. And we've continued to hold that coalition together. One of the key strategies of our governor has been to split folks, to wedge folks, right? Sort of almost blatantly kind of saying, well, I could provide funds for human services if you'll just support me in destroying public sector unions, right? Or like I could fund higher ed if the healthcare folks would get off my back, right? It's sort of this wedging people against each other because none of us are strong enough alone. And we've continued to hold that coalition together of saying, no, that's not the solution.
Has that been difficult?
It's been very difficult, but one of the reasons, that's why we organize around principles as opposed to like a very specific policy agenda. Or one of the other things we've taken away is we don't talk about divvying up the revenue. So the RBC doesn't say, we're going to raise $3 billion, 75,000 goes here and 80,000 goes here. We don't do that because that's immediately a way to splinter. Every group should advocate for their own slice of the pie, but if we don't hold together and make the pie bigger, we all lose.
We don't have that argument.
So that's been one of the things. The other thing we've done really well, and this gets back to the local question, is we've made it local. Now we have in Illinois, for folks who aren't from Illinois, we have a billionaire governor who's never held office before and is entirely unaccountable. And we have an incredibly powerful Speaker of the House on the Democratic side who's also fairly unaccountable and doesn't meet with folks. And so the way the budget impasse eventually broke was local pressure on rank and file members, right? And what eventually happened was reps on both the Dem and Republican side voted their districts as opposed to the political agendas and ideology of their leaders. And that was about doing that kind of local work and saying, I don't want to hear another governor or speaker's talking points from you, local rep so-and-so. I want you to understand that this shelter or this jobs program or this seniors program that you claim to support in your district will close if we don't have more revenue.
And that sort of super grassroots, bottom up. The giants are battling it out in Springfield.
Yep.
But you're down here in the trenches with the guys who are delivering the service on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, so the last 2 days I was in the Metro East area and then Carbondale in southern Illinois building out our local coalition tables there, right, to go and do this kind of advocacy. Because in the end, the positive note for us is as much as it's hard to do, people power can still win, particularly at a local level.
And we should say that you just mentioned my favorite word, power, which is a word that is not used often in our sector. Must be. So I would put a third thing on, on the T-shirt. After they do budget advocacy, they have to understand power.
Well, I would just say you can't advocate successfully without power.
Without power.
One of the key ingredient to successful advocacy is power and mobilization. And what I've found from nonprofits is even the EDs who are comfortable going and meeting with legislators leave that and sort of leave it there and don't tap the incredible amount of power you have, right? So you have a staff and their families and a board,
who are usually
and your volunteers, and your clients, who are all deeply invested in your service, right? And so instead of you going and meeting with your elected rep, though you should go meet with your elected rep, as a follow-up, if they don't say yes, every one of those people should make a phone call, and every one of those people should go from there, right? When we look at these big agencies, there's nothing but untapped power there, and we have to get serious about tapping our power. So if you think about IC, and you all know these numbers, you know exactly how many employees, volunteers, and clients you have. Those are all advocates in the waiting, and
again,
that's your power.
That's a different way of thinking that we need to encourage. And what you're saying is, politicians sometimes ask the question, can you help me or hurt me? And by displaying power in the way Alex is discussing, what's happening in a not too subtle way is the nonprofit constituencies are displaying we can help you and hurt you.
Absolutely.
Because we have the numbers and we're voters, by the way.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that. That's as American as apple pie.
Absolutely.
And it's perfectly permitted inside the nonprofit model. As a matter of fact, we can do much more. We can do candidate forums.
Yeah, I did a training for a coalition of nonprofits down in southern Illinois last month, talking about all the things that the IRS, this isn't Alex, this is the IRS says you can do. Basically, the basic rule as a 501c3 is, as long as you don't say vote for person X or Y, you're good. Candidate forums, voter registration, get out the vote, advocacy around issues. You can even tell people to go vote for a ballot initiative or referendum. You can advocate in favor of that. You just shouldn't electioneer. That's basically the line.
But see, most nonprofit folks don't even come close to that.
No one is close.
So that is huge news again for nonprofit leaders all across the country. So now, in our final few minutes, we turn up to a personal note. This work takes a toll on all of us in these stressing times. So basically, our Adlarians wanted a little bit of, they want to pry a little bit. And so how did you get into this work in the first place?
So I was born and raised in New York City, on the border of Spanish Harlem and Harlem, right around, and I was coming of age right around the time that Rudy Giuliani, for folks who may or may not remember him, was implementing programs like Stop and Frisk. And because I'm white and come from a pretty educated background, my parents pulled off an amazing thing of managing to be educated, cultured, and make $0. I immediately got tracked into gifted public education programs. And so I would go to schools downtown with science labs and 12 kids in a class, and the schools in my neighborhood that my friends were going to had metal detectors and 30 kids in broom closets. And then I would watch, I would walk down the street with with friends and literally have the police grab them from next to me and never touch me. And so, when you sort of watch a car accident in slow motion, watch myself be tracked and people who look like me to go to college and go to law school and get business degrees, and the people I lived with to get pushed out of high school and be arrested and end up in jail and end up in prison or end up unemployed, I had to watch those tracks happen. And so there's no way to do the sort of bootstraps argument or make the argument that, like, I worked harder, because I didn't. I fundamentally knew that. And so I had to start organizing and advocating. And in terms of particularly looking at the budgets, the basic question of power analysis as we start thinking about our work is who benefits, right, and who doesn't, who pays and who's not. Follow the money is your first journalistic question.
That's a famous quote from the Watergate guy.
Yeah, just follow where that is, and you have to know. And then right now, why I work on the Illinois state budget is, first of all, budgets are everything. They're not dollars and cents, they're values. But my whole life is about the Illinois state budget. I have 2 kids that are being adopted out of the foster care system. So that's all the state budget. They go to Chicago public schools. It's all the state budget. My wife is a PhD student at a public university in Illinois. It's all about the state budget.
Your family will go into the crapper if
literally,
this budget doesn't get taken care of.
There's no there are after-school programs, and so it's everyone in our neighborhood. And the number of places that our lives are touched by public budgets and public policy is extraordinary if we think about it. Well,
then our final question is sort of follows up on family life. I mean, I know that doing work for the public good is often a sacrifice. So talk a little bit about, the Adlerian world is about care and wellness and sort of a thought about what does it mean to have a healthy community, but also a healthy personal life. So just some words for sort of, how this impacts your personal life.
Self-care is one of the most important things we can do as people doing this work. I always said especially when I was hiring young organizers, I don't think I count as a young organizer anymore, but most people in organizing don't last more than a couple years, and it's because we don't take care of ourselves. When you get on a plane, we've all heard the safety announcement, right? If we lose cabin pressure, put your own mask on first and then help others. Right. In the nonprofit world, we never do that. We're always putting everyone else's mask on first, and so we're not going to make a lot of money. We know that. That's not where we're going to be. Oh, but we do have to take care of ourselves. So I used to, when I did faith-based organizing, I instituted a policy for my staff that Monday was our Sabbath. Because organizers work on weekends. Saturdays is when you do door knocking and actions, and you were always at a different church on Sundays. And so we don't work Mondays. It's not comp time. We don't work Mondays. And on Mondays, you go for a run or have coffee with a friend or take care of yourself. And whether it's your Monday or not, being serious about what your Sabbath time is, and making sure that you continue to invest in the things that do this. And this is not being selfish. This is about taking care of yourself for the long haul. So that you can continue. Yeah, you can continue to put other people's masks on because you've put your mask on first. So my checklist for me, and if maybe this is helpful, is every week ask yourself, did you do something for fun? Did you do something to make you physically healthy? Did you do something to make you spiritually healthy? And did you do something to make you intellectually healthy? And did you do something to take care of the relationships in your life? Whatever those are, right? So for me, who's actually pretty introverted, it's family game night. Do I do that with my kids every week? Or I really hold my Saturdays now pretty sacred. Of I do dad time, and I do something fun. We go to the zoo, we go to the park, we go to the museum, right? We do something that's letting me spend time with my kids. The last piece of things, either turn your phone off or at least turn your notifications off when you're at home. Have some actual time where you're not...
Because people are working all the time.
Yeah, if you can have a separate phone for work and for your personal life, do that. If not, at least turn the notifications off for some amount of time that we're not on call. Because when you're on call 24/7, you burn yourself out, and burnout, especially in these tough budget times, will destroy us and our movement and our sector.
We
So
gotta take care of ourselves.
you have to take care of yourselves and others.
Words to the wise. A final thing, Alex. So this video will be around for a while. What do you have to say to people who have the right heart and they want to change the world? They want to make it a better place.
Yeah. Understand power. Advocate around systems and structures. Don't do it alone. Connect with the groups that are out there. I promise you they exist. No matter where you are, there are groups that are doing this kind of advocacy and work. And then take care of yourself for the long haul. Build a program that thinks about power and structure. I'm actually just finishing the last chapter of a book I've been asked to write on faith-based organizing and doing this for faith-based communities. And it's the same. How do you build long-term structures to allow us to win, but don't be afraid of those things, because if we don't build power to change systems and structures, particularly looking at our budgets, because that's where real decisions happen, right? Where we put our resources. And so getting comfortable advocating around that is at our core.
All right, take care of yourself so we can take care of the society that's in peril.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex Wiesendanger of the Responsible Budget Coalition. This is Tom Tresser for Adler University's Nonprofit Management Program saying thank you once again.
Thanks so much.